Hello, students. So it's rather apropos that Mr. Phillips and I are going to discuss political participation on what is a very, very consequential midterm election day. So nonetheless, we felt inspired to go ahead and knock out this particular PowerPoint today. And this is perhaps one of the most, if you will, activities that will define, a nation, a people, but it is also one of the single most important, right, factors to consider whenever you're talking about a democracy or at least a democratic republic, which we are, and that there is a role for the citizen to play in the government. And all governments are defined by the kind of relationship that they have with their citizenry and the extent to which the citizenry can affect their government. So political participation is hugely important in trying to define what kind of government you have and what kind of policies will be implemented. So as you can see, political participation encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses all actions that citizens may partake in that are intended to influence the selection of government officials and the development of policy. So what is considered political participation? Most of us, when we think of political participation, probably think of voting, and rightfully so, because this is probably one of the most important ways that most Americans, or at least most people, do engage in politics, and that's through the ballot box and going and voting to register, of course, their support for one candidate or another. And when they register their support for one candidate or another, they are also registering their support, in theory, for the ideas that that candidate represents, and perhaps as well the policies that they would like to see implemented. In addition to voting, there are other methods, and we'll discuss those in short order. So overall, we're looking at activities that are aimed at influencing public policy. We mentioned voting already. That's in red because it's the most, if you will, the activity that most Americans, most people engage in, or this is the method that's most common in terms of how people participate politically. This is the method that's most common, or the most common method of political participation, and you should note that. In addition, we have here protesting. While protesting is not as common, in other words, it isn't as engaged in by as many people, it is the most, or one of the most visible ways in which people participate. And so we have that up here as well, since many people are familiar with this form of political participation. In addition, there's also letter writing. We discussed this when we were in the legislative unit and mentioned how people can write their congressperson whenever they feel inspired, or if they feel compelled to comment on some particular legislation that is being debated, or that they wish their congressman to take up a certain cause or vote against, a certain individual that's being nominated. But this is also a method that people use. Petition writing. In fact, we have a student from Walton, indeed, who started an organization that deals with petition writing. So this is certainly one of the methods that people engage in to participate in politics. And finally, volunteering for a political party or an interest group, as many people have already done in this election. There have been many students who have canvassed, or the voter registration drives, although that's nonpartisan in nature, but at least it should be. But the point of the matter being that volunteering for a campaign or for an interest group can also constitute a form of political participation. These four make up some of the most visible and the most common forms of political participation. And we're going to see a list here, coming up soon that will enumerate the most common versus the least common forms of political participation. You want to mention?
Okay, so this list shows you approximately, from most common to least common. I'm not sure if this is fully 100% accurate, but obviously, yeah, voting is usually the easiest and most common way people would participate. You can see just being affiliated with an organization, like belonging to a party or an interest group, or you have contacting public officials, letters, emails, phone calls. Fairly, again, not too involved, doesn't take too much time. And then attending meetings, so you see things start to get more involved, taking more of people's times. So yeah, like actually attending a meeting of that organization, like a party meeting or an interest group meeting or just some type of community meeting. You have campaign contributions, so giving money. Again, it's doesn't take a lot of effort, but you see fewer people do that than simply voting or something like that. But so contributing to someone's campaign, you have, I'm not sure, informal community activity, kind of a vague statement, I guess. Just getting involved in maybe it could be get out the vote efforts or, canvassing, that type of thing. So attending local board meetings, so actually attending a government meeting, like a school board or town hall meeting. A congressperson holds a local, like a town hall in their district, and voters can go ask questions. That's the next one. So you have so actually working on a campaign, volunteering on a campaign, making phone calls. So some of the stuff overlaps, but you have protesting. Again, which is rare, but gets a lot of, as Mr. Davila said, gets a lot of attention. And I think it's maybe this has moved up the list as far as more common recently. Yes. Because we've seen a lot more protests, at least, I don't know the statistics on it, but I know just from anecdotal and just, seeing things, I don't remember this much protest taking place since Trump became president. You saw the Women's March like the day after, huge, massive numbers of people taking to the streets. So anyway, and then board membership, which I assume, I've always kind of confused by that term they use, but I guess like if actually maybe holding an office, right? Or yeah. It's like holding some position of power within the government at various levels. So obviously that's the least common, but that, hey, that's a great way to participate, right? So if you can become, president, hey, that'd be great. Just remember us. Remember your favorite government teachers when you're, carving out those tax breaks. So, indeed. Anyway. So this graph just shows you the same thing, but ties some percentages to it. It's probably a few years, a little bit dated, but yeah, obviously voting by far outpaces the other forms of participation because it really, involves the least amount of time and effort typically. But we'd like to see that number be even higher, and we'd like to see all these things. The more people are involved, I think the better government we're going to have, right? People getting involved is going to make the government more responsive to the people, and hopefully lead to better government.
Let's be clear, these numbers, showing 71%, that is not the regular rate of participation. We max out at 60%, folks. So this is just showing, of the people who, rather, when they survey people and they say, well, how do you participate, politically, of those people, 71% of them did indeed include voting as one form or method in which, in the way they voted.
They might have said, like, have you ever done this?
Right.
Or, which of these have you done, in the last, 10 years? I don't know how the question was phrased. So
yeah, if we're ever hitting 71%, which hopefully we can, I really hope so. You'll see two very happy government teachers here, for sure. All right. So there's a perennial question, why don't Americans vote? I just mentioned to you that our best elections, we're maxing out like around 60, 65% maybe. That's a really good turnout for us. That means nearly 40%, right? That means at least 4 out of every 10 people are deciding that it's not even worth their time, or that it doesn't matter, or that they're too busy. I'm purposely emphasizing these reasons because a lot of these are the reasons given. But I want to be clear before we go into this and we start saying, what's wrong with these people? The truth of the matter is that when we look at when we compare, if you will, when we compare the voting procedures and rules and regulations to other countries, America does not make voting very easy. And so there are a variety of reasons why certain groups in particular find it more difficult to vote, because there have been efforts historically and currently to make it more difficult, frankly, to vote. There are more hoops to jump through. And there are various reasons and motivations for that, and we can discuss that. But the point is that this is, when we're talking about why don't Americans vote, I don't want this to be a single-sided sort of, it's just their fault and they're lazy. There are reasons why, and it doesn't mean that they shouldn't ultimately vote, right? And we were talking to 2 civics teachers, and we're very invested in government and process, and we believe there's a lot of importance in voting. So we would argue that even those persons who feel disaffected and think that it won't make a difference, it's still on balance in your interest to vote, right? Because the consequence of not voting and then your vote actually meaning something is so much greater than having voted and your vote not meaning something. And so on balance, it's sort of like Pascal's wager. Pascal was a famous philosopher who said, on balance, it's better to believe in God than not, because, there's so much more benefit to doing so. But this is not a religious class. I was just making it clear what I meant by Pascal's wager. Nonetheless, the point of the matter is, and we'll get into other reasons why voting is so important. One of the reasons why Americans don't vote is because people are poorly informed. There are people, indeed, who say, look, I don't know enough to vote. The sad truth is that there's plenty of people who probably know less than those people who are voting, right? So I often tell my students that, don't short sell yourself, because you probably actually know more than many people who decide that they do know everything, right? And that sort of reminds me of Socrates when he says, the wise man is the person who knows that he knows nothing, right? Because they understand that the moment when one assumes that they know everything, that's when ignorance sets in and sort of there's no more learning going on. So the point of the matter is that if you're reflective enough, if you're perceptive enough to realize that, hey, there's always more I could know, then you probably are well on your way to being, say, more informed than many who are voting. So nonetheless, one of the reasons is...
And let's just say that if you feel like you're too poorly informed, then you know what you can do? Get informed, right? So that's just all these excuses, ultimately we're going to say, most of these excuses are lame, and there's no real good reason not to vote unless you were kept from voting, which we will talk about some of those cases. So yeah, it's understandable that people feel, disaffected, and we'll talk in a few more slides, I think, about what we mean by political efficacy. But it's understandable that a lot of people feel like the government doesn't listen to them, because in reality that is true a lot of times, that government leaders sometimes, last unit we'll study interest groups and the powerful nature of those groups, but unfortunately, politicians a lot of times listen to their big donors, and they listen to their interest group supporters and their base supporters, and they often, don't seem to respond to the will of the people. And so I can understand the frustration, but that's all the more reason to get involved, right? And not just to say, well, throw up my hands and my vote's not going to make any difference, so I guess I just, that's just not the right answer, right? The answer is to force politicians to change their ways and to listen to the people, and so you must get involved.
Just remember back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s writing a letter from Birmingham jail, and there were overt racist efforts to keep his group that he was primarily focused on in terms of the civil rights movement in particular instances from voting at all, but still they would go through the struggle of voting because they knew how consequential it was. I think one of the most important or telltale signs that voting is so important is look at the lengths that people go to try to prevent you from voting. See, if voting didn't matter, why is so much money, why is so much time and effort spent on denying you the right to vote? Just contemplate that for a moment, right? And I always remind my students, I say, even if you felt like, right, that they don't listen to you, the solution, as Mr. Phillips pointed out, is not to throw your hands up and say, well, since they're not listening to me, I'm not going to participate. Because that only, if you will continue the, if you will, vicious cycle, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like, hey, I'm not going to participate because they don't listen to me. Oh gosh, look, they're still not listening to me. Of course they're not going to listen to you if you've given up, right? They're going to focus on the people who show up and show out. So those are the persons that are going to, in groups that are going to get attention. And one sure way of ensuring that you'll never get heard is by not participating.
Maybe gotta go. So this is a big one. There are barriers to voting. So in these cases, we would say this is a valid reason. It's not justifiable, but it's valid from the person's perspective that didn't vote, that they didn't vote. It's not valid that these things are in place. But photo ID laws seem on their face to be fairly simple. Like, okay, show your ID to vote, but it does act as a barrier if you think about to different people who, aren't as likely to have ID, which, we can think about who those people are, right? Like elderly people, poor people, that certain groups, and that tends to disproportionately affect also minorities. And so, or some states, you may have ID, but it's expired. You have your ID, but you don't drive anymore, or, you just, if you take the bus to get to work, or, things like that, maybe you let your license lapse.
So city dwellers or urban
voters, which is more minority voters again. So anyway, but we see these legal barriers, like the 15th Amendment had to be put in place to say you could not discriminate in voting based on race, but we know that was ratified in 1870, and severe discrimination continued against minorities, especially in voting. So race was still definitely used as a factor, and people's votes were suppressed through all sorts of means. The 19th Amendment is women's right to vote. 23rd Amendment gives DC voters the right to elect the president, or to vote for president. The 24th Amendment is very important. It ends what was called a poll tax. So a lot of states had poll taxes in place. In other words, you have to pay to vote. You have to pay money in order to cast your ballot. And that was just one of many methods used by states who were trying to suppress voting, especially, again, amongst minority voters who were targeted. You saw other things like, of course, you had the literacy tests in a lot of southern states where people had to pass these so-called literacy tests, which were really, complicated tests over the government. And civics tests. And so you had all white primaries, grandfather clause, all sorts of things you'll probably learn more about in U.S. history. But yeah, definitely, make note of the 24th Amendment, which bans the use of poll taxes to remove that barrier. And then 26th Amendment, lowers the voting age to 18.
One other thing, so I always tell students, it's very interesting to always look into the reasons why policies were made. And it's interesting with the photo ID rules that certain states see this as somehow necessary while others don't, in terms of preserving the integrity of the vote. So what I often have students do is I said, okay, Well, let's research how big of a problem was voter integrity. In other words, how many instances have we had valid that have been verified of voter fraud? And when you look at that and compare that to how much time and effort and money were put into photo ID rules, you realize that there's a bit of a disconnect, that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of evidence at all that has been forwarded to show or demonstrate that there's been rampant voter fraud. So one has to wonder, and a lot of these photo ID rules didn't come into effect until the 2000s. And so was there just not voter fraud up until 2010? I mean, that's highly unlikely. And was voter fraud just on, the rise around 2010? Probably not. So it's interesting to investigate why these rules were put in place. And as Mr. Phillips already noted, which groups in particular are going to suffer the consequences or are likely to be, affected negatively by these rules. And that then starts to reveal some other interesting factors, and we'll talk about the various claims around photo ID rules. But we always encourage our students to research, right, and look into the reasons. Don't just accept what the reasons are, but look into them for yourself. And you may agree with them, you may not. Either way, the point is that it's important to research them and know them for yourself.
And then there's some other requirements that, for the most part, people accept, which is, you should have to be a certain age. We can argue over what that age is, but I think we all agree that, 5 and 6 year olds shouldn't be voting because they don't have, the maturity or knowledge at that point. Maybe we should just base it on if you can pass a test, or in a sense, if you're younger than 18 and you can show that you're, that you are informed on the issues, but if it truly was a fair test. But, and the citizenship requirement, so just like most countries, you have to be a citizen of the United States. You don't have to be born a citizen, but you have to become a citizen. Some of these other reasons are not as big of a deal maybe, but this is pretty important that some people just don't, if the election is not competitive, and so the fact that we have these gerrymandered districts and statewide elections in some states, they're not competitive because the state leans so heavily to one side or the other. That's why, other countries, when they do a national vote, people show up because it doesn't matter where you live. In our country, we'll talk about some of the reasons, but that these single member districts, where they're gerrymandered for the House, for example, people, I can understand why someone would be less likely to show up if there's not even a candidate for their party or they're expected to lose by 50 points. This is not really why, but that, you see trends of younger people and minorities, if, urban populations perhaps, where there's less or lower voter turnout. But again, some of this has to do with the laws that are targeted to discriminate against certain people. You could blame, in a sense, sometimes parties maybe aren't doing a good enough job or spending enough money on mobilizing, like get out the vote efforts. The fact that, people, maybe we could do more to educate. Maybe the government should take a bigger role in promoting voting, right, instead of trying to discourage it. Registration is really, to me, is one of the main problems that we face in terms of some people who try to vote and are turned away because they didn't renew their registration. We've also seen states recently who've been purging their voter rolls. So even, I think for as little as if you didn't vote in the last election, they assume, oh, maybe this person has moved, and so they purge you from the rolls, and you wouldn't realize that that your registration had been canceled and your name had been removed, until you actually show up to vote on election day. Now, some states have done something which is very positive, which is they've tried to increase registration. So universal registration is the idea that the government takes it upon itself to register everyone. And, that I think would be a great step forward. But also what some states have done is simply allow you to register to vote on the same day as the election. So same day registration, which seems logical, right? If they say you need to have an ID, and if you show that ID, then why not let people go ahead and vote, right? Why do you have to follow an additional procedure to like fill out paperwork and register. So
And wait months,
Yeah.
right, prior to.
so it's just it's crazy, but again, there's no real cost, actual cost. There's no physical cost to not voting. In other words, like some countries have fines associated with people who don't vote, like Australia. You're fined for not voting. So we don't have that particular type of cost, or you get punished or arrested or something like. Obviously, but there is a cost in terms of groups that don't vote also tend to get less benefits from the government, and I know for me, I always just feel happy when I go vote.
So there's another thing. I mean, while there is not a direct cost associated with voting, I do remind students that it is costlier for some people more so than others. For example, if you don't have a car, right, and then you have to arrange, a way to get to the polls, right? So that's going to cost you whatever a bus or train fare will cost you, or Uber, right, or Lyft. But the other thing is that, and especially you can imagine that this is going to be more burdensome for people who are not as wealthy, who are not as well off. Especially, let's imagine that you have like a single mom, right? And she now has to arrange also a babysitter, or she has to take her kids with her, right? And if it's raining out like it is today, or if it is cold, or if one of her children is, not feeling well, there's definitely a cost, in terms of trying to get to the polls to vote, especially as Mr. Phillips has already mentioned, given all the barriers that we have in place in some states. Some states have put in many more barriers to voting, while others have gone the other direction and have made it much easier to vote. And what's interesting is that there's no evidence to suggest that those states who have put more barriers in have had better success rates in terms of preventing any kind of fraud, because fraud is so minimal to non-existent in many cases. So that it's interesting to see all these efforts, despite the lack of evidence of actual instances of widespread fraud.
I think I'm not. The numbers may not be right on, but I think they found out of like 1 billion votes cast over like the last 10 years, there's been like maybe like 18 instances where people were actually prosecuted for election fraud. So I mean, 18 out of like 1 billion is
Infinitesimally small, let's put it that way.
And sometimes, they argue sometimes, well, people are their names are on multiple ballot, they're on the voting rolls in more than one state. That doesn't mean they're actually voting. So people are going to get in their car and drive from state to state to get that one extra vote. I mean,
it's just
and
unlikely.
It's just probably what happened is they just moved, right? And they didn't, and you don't have to inform the state that you left anyway. So but the point is, yes, voting fraud is basically non-existent. I'm not sure this is a major factor, although, people may be turned off if, maybe from voting on the entire ballot. So you may vote, some people go in and vote for president and then they just leave because they, because I can understand, because I know even like us who we try our best to get informed about the elections, but when you get down to like, county service, or insurance commissioner and like, soil conservationist or whatever, or a local sheriff or something, you're like, I really don't know, you can't, even if you want to, you can't really find out much about these people, or like people running as local judges and stuff. So anyway, so this, I imagine this is probably even lower now, but look at how much this statistic shows people's confidence in government has dropped, and their trust in government to do what is right. So do you think the government does what is right all or most of the time? Do you trust that? And that, look at back in the late 50s, how high the trust was. Now, I mean, maybe that was misguided. Maybe they shouldn't have trusted government that much, but it's still a statement of, you see these big drops. Now, what happened? You see, well, during the 60s, you had the Vietnam War. Then you see it really, drops after the Watergate incident, but it really hasn't recovered since then, right? So people, you see a brief spike after 9/11, but then back down. So as of 2012, 22% that trust their government. sort of a sad state of affairs. But on the other hand, does the government do enough to really try to earn that back?
And the reason why we're bringing this up is because there's a correlation between people's trust in their government and their willingness, if you will, to participate in that government, right? If you believe that the government's trustworthy, that it's doing good things, then you may be more likely to participate or engage that government. If you feel that the government's not trustful and isn't doing great things, you may feel like you don't want to participate or you feel disaffected. So here you see a chart showing you confidence in Congress. We talked to you a little bit about this already, frankly, in the legislative PowerPoint. But since Congress is a part of government, the distrust would certainly extend to it as well. Congress in particular has been a dysfunctional body in especially the sort of, I would say since the, late 80s to the, onward, frankly, or if even the early 90s. But the point of the matter here is that this is going to have an impact on how people feel about participating, because if their confidence in Congress is so abysmally low, they may feel like it's maybe not even as consequential. And remember when we talked about the role of the presidency versus Congress, a lot of people have regarded now the presidency or in the vote for the presidency much more consequential than Congress, which may help explain why midterm election turnout rates are much lower than the general election where the people are voting for the president as well. Nonetheless, it's something worth noting.
All right. So this is this, you can see the data here shows voter turnout. Now this is a little misleading. The numbers are a little lower than you would see on some other statistics or data presentations, because it's saying voting age population. So basically trying to calculate all Americans who would be 18 or older. And I imagine that might also include, people who are immigrants. So I'm not quite sure how this data was gathered, but I know that saying voting age would also include, for instance, people who maybe in some states where felons aren't allowed to vote, like Georgia, after you commit a felony. Some states are reconsidering that. After you serve your time, you get to vote again. But it may also include people with, intellectual or developmental delays that aren't allowed to vote, things like that. Anyway, but so a more accurate number usually is when you see voting eligible population, percentage of voting eligible. But anyway, this still, you notice the bold years versus the non-bolded years. And what does that tell us? Well, the bolded years, as you might know, would be presidential election years, and the non-bolded years are midterm election years, which we are, again, today is our midterm of 2018. So hopefully we'll break some of these trends from the past here, where you see what you normally see is a significant drop-off, right, in voter turnout for midterms versus presidential elections, because the perception people have is, oh, well, presidential elections are more important. And so I need to show up for that, but not necessarily the midterm. Because, it's just members of Congress. Like, who cares, right? But it's very consequential. Like, who controls Congress? And this is oftentimes when you see a major shift in party control, because the party that's out of power is the one that's more motivated to show up. And so you a lot of times you see the president's party really suffers in the midterms, even if the president's popular at the time.
But especially when they're unpopular.
Right. And so people who a lot of times vote more out of anger than they do out of love, right? So it's so you see, the midterms are very important, especially if you support the party that's in power, because the people who are going to probably show up are those who don't like that party. Anyway, so
yep.
So this is a graphic I think was maybe in USA Today, but it's interesting when they surveyed people who didn't vote. Now this goes back to 2000, but I think you would see similar excuses given. I say excuses because again I see these as mostly unacceptable or lame, excuses. It's interesting because what I always tell students is, you have the people that said they were too busy to vote. Then you look down a couple and you see not interested. They were apathetic. They didn't care, right? What I always say is, really, to me, that's the same group of people. It's just the too busy people are liars, and the people who are saying they just didn't care, at least they're honest, lazy people, right? At least they say, well, why didn't you vote? Oh, I was too busy. No, come on, seriously. Like, you were from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., or, plus now we have early voting. And so if you're too busy, that just really means, like, what if I had said, hey, if you show up to vote, I'll give you $1 million. Do you think you would have found time in the day to show up? I think you would, right? So too busy, that's like, I was too busy to do my homework. I was playing video games and I was on Snapchat, and, so I was just way too busy, right?
Let me chime in here for a moment, because there's really no such thing as not voting. Because the truth is that when you don't vote, someone else's voice is being amplified, right? So it doesn't, politics, the government doesn't care at the end of the day. You deciding not to vote doesn't register to the government as having to respond to that per se. In other words, you're allowing someone else's vote to count more, or you could put it another way, you're allowing someone else to speak for you. And that's something I think that a lot of people fail to understand. But there's really the concept of not voting, as if there's some way to be completely neutral in this process. It just doesn't exist. I mean, politics and policy are going to affect you whether you decided to engage the process or not. The only real question is, are you going to speak for yourself, or are you going to let someone speak for you?
Right. You see some of these other reasons. Didn't like the candidates, and I say, come on, put on your big boy pants or big girl pants. Come on, you didn't like the candidate. I mean, pick one. There's still, that's when people say, oh, there's no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Oh, come on. They're both going to be equally bad. And so, some people are saying, maybe that wasn't the case. So they, didn't like the candidates. To me, again, that's not an excuse. Pick one, and or write someone in if you want. But the forgot, those people I worry about. Like, how did you forget it was election day? There's only signs everywhere, and vote here, and people wearing their stickers.
And TV ads.
In fact, there was a movement called Vote or Die, I think was sponsored by P. Diddy, kind of especially targeted towards young people. Vote or die, right? It's that important, right? Like, it's a life or death. Like, voting is really important. So anyway, he had this campaign to, where celebrities volunteered, and one of them was Paris Hilton. She, one of those pseudo celebrities that she's famous because she's rich, I guess. But and anyway, so she did the campaign and wore the shirt and posed for the internet and all that stuff. Vote or die and all this stuff. And then apparently on election day she forgot to vote. So I don't know if that meant she had to die or, but anyway. But the only one that's legitimate here, I think, is maybe the transportation. Yeah, if some people that's true, but the registration problems, and that's the people I feel. I feel that's unjust, that you are not allowed to vote simply because you were kept from registering or you didn't change your registration in time. And I think that's unacceptable.
Or somebody handling your registration did so improperly, which that has happened as well. So the question then follows, who does vote, right? We've talked about that group of voters who doesn't. And, we should look here at some trends. So it's interesting. You're going to find that essentially the trend here is higher, 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 right? I mean, so higher level of education, more likely to vote. Higher income, more likely to vote. Higher age, in other words, if you're older, they tend to vote more often. And a lot of these have reasons to do with, convenience, availability, the fact that they feel more engaged. To some extent, you can imagine people with higher incomes and higher education. They may be people who are doing well in society, right, and feel a part of it. And of course, older people, they have had, some would argue that they have more free time, right, if they're retired, to go and do these things, and at least maybe have at that point developed some experience voting already. And we'll find that that's one of the other trends. If you or someone close to you votes on a regular basis, then you are more likely to vote, in particular your parents, right? So if your parents are regular voters, you're more likely to be a regular voter. Notice that women vote slightly at higher rates than men do. but it's very small. I mean, that rate, it could be changing, but they do slightly vote at higher rates. And then you can see women have a higher tendency to vote for Democrats than Republicans. We'll get into those trends, I think, when we talk about socialization. Or did you want us?
Yeah, I mean, we call it the gender gap, right? So, and that gender gap has grown to, like, I think, record numbers recently. You typically see, like, if you look at like the George Bush elections or Barack Obama, you started to see an uptick for women, split between men and women with Obama. But with Trump, it's just become, just unbelievably
magnified.
High. Like, you have women, we'll see what happens today, but the gender gap apparently has grown to as high as what, 20%?
It's ballooned to almost about 20 to 23% in terms of the gap. Usually it's around 9 or 11 point gap.
So what we mean by that is, like, if you don't know, so basically that you'd see like 60% of women voted, Democratic, and 40% of men voted Democratic, and then like the opposite, maybe 55% of men, but the overall split, so you end up with like overall, 55% of women voted Democratic and 55% of men voted Republican. It's that 10-point, gap there, that
a differential. And so we'll see here as well with race, whites tend to vote more regularly than African Americans and other groups. Now, again, think historically why that may be the case, right? All these other groups have been historically disenfranchised for a lot longer, intimidated, told that they were not or did not have the right to vote. And so you can imagine then that part of the reason for this has to do with the fact that there have been less barriers put in place for whites to vote than minority groups. And you can see that it takes time to overcome those, if you will, obstacles. And so we see a time, a delay, if you will, from the time when a group has been enfranchised, in other words, given the right to vote, to when they fully actualize their potential, meaning when they realize their potential, meaning when we have rates of participation that are consistent with the percentage of the population they make up in society. And so we'll see here, Asian Americans in particular, they're actually one of the fastest minority groups in growing groups in the country, but they vote at the lowest rates, really, than all other demographic groups.
Hispanic. So really, what the African American versus white turnout has become very narrow. There's not a big gap. In other words, and in fact, African American turnout exceeded white turnout in 2008 and 2012. So it's really sort of a non-significant difference between white and black voting in recent years, but you see a big drop when it comes to Hispanic and Asian Americans and Native Americans and so forth, other minority groups. Just on education, that is the biggest factor, thus it's listed first. If you looked at some data from the early 2000s, there was, I think, voter turnout for a presidential election, I think it was 2004, you saw, I think it was 82% of people with advanced degrees participated and voted, which, people with, more than simply college education, but, masters, PhDs, things like that, versus non-high school graduates whose turnout was, I believe, in the 30s. So you had about a 50-point percentage turnout gap between the most and least educated people.
In addition to those other factors we just mentioned, like I mentioned before, that if your parents vote, you're likely to vote as well. So it's habit forming. Voting is habit forming. That's often what's said about voting. And so occupation as well, that sort of overlaps, doesn't it, with higher education perhaps, as well as higher income. But if you're a white-collar professional, you're more likely to vote than blue-collar workers. To be more specific, white-collar professional speaks to professions like doctors, lawyers, and businessmen, business people, I should say. And blue-collar workers are more your factory workers, your carpenters, people who work with their hands, farmers and so on, in terms of the laborers. And you'll see as well that religion, those who tend to attend church more regularly vote more often than occasional or non-church goers. I often tell students that one of the reasons for that may be that they're more used to institutions, right? And so being engaged with an institution and seeing the role of an institution, because churches are institutions, religions are institutions to some extent as well. And so therefore, they're familiar then with going to vote, right, and participating in yet another institution, the government, to affect change. And then finally, we have exposure to media. Those who read and watch the news more often are more likely to vote as well because they,
Which makes sense.
yeah, they seem to be more informed, right? And you can see that there's going to be overlap between these characteristics, right? To some extent, you could imagine that someone who is more educated is more likely to be well-read and informed on the news and so on.
Have people who, if you're involved, if you take the time to get involved in a party and you volunteer for campaigns and you're in an interest group or something and you give money and write letters, obviously that also means you're probably more likely to vote.
So this concept of political efficacy speaks to an individual's belief in their ability to affect change in the government. So essentially, there's two types of efficacy. You want to mention external and internal, or should we?
I think, yeah, I mean, internal efficacy, I think, is more like you feel like you can understand how the government works and like, you have enough knowledge that your participation, is an informed participation. So, you kind of understand and you follow events and things like that. Whereas external efficacy, I think, is more your belief that by acting, by voting, the government will actually respond to what you do. So like by getting involved, it will actually make a difference, right?
Correct. And so you can imagine this is a very important term to know, a very important factor to consider, especially when we're talking about participation. The higher one's political efficacy clearly will correspond to a higher level of political participation. So understand that relationship. Historically, who voted and when? We already went over this when we talked about the amendments. Mr. Phillips had already mentioned the 15th Amendment, right, with respect to African Americans getting the right to vote in 1919 and then ratified by 1920, I believe it was the 19th Amendment for women and so on, right? I mean, so you should be familiar with those amendments. In addition, I want you to understand, like Mr. Phillips had mentioned already, that the 15th Amendment, while it enfranchised African Americans, that doesn't mean that there weren't additional barriers put in place to disenfranchise them, like the literacy test, as well as the poll tax and others. And it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act, right, that you studied in the last unit, that we started to see the federal government intervene and stop states, in particular southern states, from disenfranchising minority voters. And so you should be somewhat familiar with the various amendments, but also the acts of Congress that dealt with voting and enfranchisement.
All right, so this is just a quick overview of, so again, you can look over this, we're not going to focus on it too much, but remember originally it was mainly just white males and you had to have some type of land ownership to be able to vote, and that was the case for much of our early history. People eventually, they started to add, got rid of the property requirement, but really it was still white males for much of our history, and unfortunately, and so, we talked about some of those changes that, and even when the laws were passed, the amendments were passed, there's still efforts to suppress voting on
even today,
groups.
yes.
Today, which is shameful. So anyway, so we kind of covered this. And so this is, again, just gives you more detail to look over on what we had already talked about. So traditionally the lowest, by age, by far, the lowest turnout is from the younger voters, 18 to 24, or sometimes you see it 18 to 29, but you see a significant gap, right? It's about 20%, looks like on average, gap between people 25 and older versus 18 to 24. The gap, would be even higher if you looked at, say, 60. The highest turnout is really probably about 65 to 74, that age group. It starts to tail off a little bit as people get into their 80s and 90s for different reasons like health and availability to get to the polls and things like that. But really, the older people tend to be the best voters. Younger people are the worst. And so I hope this will change. I hope you guys will be part of that change. And, again, we've tried to really emphasize it's super important, and, it's great. It's really, it's just, it's going to make a big difference. If you don't like the way things are, you got to get out there and vote. Or even if you do like the way things are, you got to keep voting.
Right. I mean, and you have to always keep this in mind, right? The government's going to respond to the people who are in its face, who are making the government reconcile, or rather deal with it. And, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized this. Remember in that letter from Birmingham jail as well, the idea that there is something known as constructive tension, right? That you need to make people confront you. In other words, and realize that you're there in order for them to take your issues or interests seriously. If you wish for, say, student debt not to be so astronomically high, or college not to be so prohibitively expensive, any number of these things that will affect you for the rest of your life, or environmental issues if you're concerned about those, these things are hugely consequential and affect you directly. And the reason why you often get the worst end of it in terms of legislation is because your group is so low in terms of the turnout when it comes to voting. So there isn't as much of a cost or a consequence for legislators when they ignore your interests, because you're just not coming out in numbers for them to be forced to pay attention to you. I think that's something you have to realize. Make them pay attention to you. And the way you do that is coming out in force in numbers in terms of voting. So keep that in mind. These are graphics that show you the youth percent of participation. You'll see that as far as a group, younger people tend to vote more liberal, or for more liberal policies, which tends to align more with the Democratic Party, and that has continued even up till today. So you saw that particularly pronounced in 2004, and it's continued all the way up through 2018. And so that's worth noting as well in terms of, which parties may make more efforts to get certain groups of people out to vote. Various institutions, organizations like Rock the Vote, I think MTV did Rock the Vote to help increase younger voter participation and turnout, with some success, actually. Not resounding success per se, but with some success nonetheless. And you've seen, like Mr. Phillips has mentioned, other groups like P. Diddy and others that have started groups to help increase the amount of young people participating so that their voice and their interests are heard.
Okay, so there's some stuff about, so we are in general one of the lower turnout countries as far as, developed or, highly developed countries economically and with our education level. So definitely, Europeans have higher turnout. Let's look at some of the reasons why. So part of it is just the sheer number of offices. So especially for local races, if you see there's even off-year elections that we hold for local races, or say the SPLOST vote for special, for the sales tax for schools. Those types of elections, the extremely low turnout, 10% or less in some cases. Whereas in Europe, they have fewer offices, but also fewer elections. And so, just the whole way they set up their, let's see with some of the other, I don't want to overlap with it.
Well, hold on 1 minute. It's interesting because if you look down below, it seems like too much democracy in terms of voting is actually exhausting, like that there's an inverse relationship. And that's a little counterintuitive, that you would think that the more opportunities to vote, the higher rate of democracy or participation, but the opposite is true.
And I don't think this is the biggest factor. So let's look at some of the other ones. So this is a big one, that I think not just the voting procedures, but again, in countries I know like France, I think they do universal registration. I mean, the government is easily able to keep track. They know everything about us, right? They pry into all of our private details. But yet when it comes to voting, they make us go fill out forms and renew them and all this stuff, you know what I mean? And so they could easily, they have the data, you know, I'm sure like Amazon or like any company, all the online companies have all our data. They know
the
exactly.
IRS certainly has that information. It's ironic, isn't it? So that, you know, the government definitely knows our information and whether or not
when it comes to taxes.
Yeah, and whether or not we're citizens when it comes to us paying things. But when it comes to us actually dictating
Like,
or
we don't know who you are.
Right.
You gotta tell us.
That is truly curious, and one of the frustrations, frankly, our frustrations, but also other Americans with why is it so difficult, you know, to vote in a lot of places in the U.S.
So yeah, I mean, part of it. So it's the registration, and you know, some countries require voting, but I still think there's even more important reasons. Let's see what else we have here. Again, I don't think it's really the procedures are part of it. Yeah, like we said, the registration is a big part of it. I think, and again, I don't know if.
I mean, no, I think this is valid. I mean,
well, yeah, but I think one of the biggest differences also those, you know, again, we talked about the competitive nature. In a lot of European countries, every vote counts because they vote nationally, and you know, oftentimes they fill in their party slots based on how much percentage that party receives. So everyone's vote counts, you know, and matters and can make a difference. Even the smaller parties often get representation. So like in our country, if you support a third party or you're independent, you may not like the Republican or the Democratic Party, and you know your candidate has no chance to win. So in some countries, like in Germany or Italy, or you know, if your party gets 10% of the vote, you don't win, but you still get seats and you still get a voice because you get seats in the parliament. You know, so it'd be like if the Libertarians got 10% of the vote nationally, they would get maybe get 40 seats in the House of Representatives, which would not be insignificant, right? They
or
would
the Green Party,
right? And so. So that, I don't remember if that's one of the ones we have, but so registration is big because a lot of people, just simply because of the paperwork, or now we have this exact match system in Georgia apparently where people, leave out a dot or a middle initial or a dash in their name, and they say, oh, well, it doesn't match what we have on record. This must be someone trying to fraudulently vote, fake voter.
Well, the irony there too is that the people who are evaluating these signatures are not handwriting experts. Right. And this is basically, a novice, somebody.
Right, I know my signature looks different every time I do it.
Right. And so how does one know?
I had to do that for getting a bank loan one time. They're like, you have to be really careful that your signature looks the same on each page. And I was so nervous because I was like, I can't sign my name the same way twice. And so anyway, and you see this, there was what was called I can't remember, I always forget the official name, but the Motor Voter Bill, Motor Voter Act was passed in the 90s to try to make it, easier to register to vote. So basically requires states that when you basically deal with the government, when you renew your license or apply for government services, or basically any interaction you have with the state or local government, they must also ask you if you want to register to vote. Correct. And that was a good law that increased registration. Unfortunately, just registering doesn't mean people are going to show up to vote, but that's a good step forward. And like I said, I wish we would just get rid of that.
It's worth noting, Mr. Phillips mentioned universal registration. Some states like Oregon and California are taking up or have already passed legislation to do universal registration. So these are things that states can actually definitely, do. And I
think it's maybe Washington or Oregon who does the vote by mail.
Yeah, Oregon is the one that does vote by mail.
Yeah, so like everybody votes by mail, and so they just send out the ballots to everyone. And because right now, in some states are putting voting by mail as an option, but you still have to request the ballot, and sometimes they don't count them if it's not close enough and things like that. So I think, but if everyone voted by mail, that might be another way to do it. We've talked, online voting, but the problem with that, of course, is the security issues and the equity of who has access.
Yeah, although we can discuss that later. All right, these are just some graphs showing you voter turnout. These are a little dated, but they still are pretty relevant in terms of how we compare to other parts of the world. Also notice here that Americans, even though they're less likely to vote and turn out, they are more likely to participate in other ways, such as writing letters to public officials or engaging in demonstrations. also, this is definitely a sore point for myself and Mr. Phillips, as well as education, but as well as for our country, is how abysmally low and, if you will, how inadequate to some extent our understanding, or Americans' understanding, is of their own government. And these numbers, even though this is a 1998 test, and you're like, oh my God, that's like, decades and decades ago, these numbers are still, you would still see similar numbers like this even today. I promise you, you can look these statistics up. In fact, I'm wondering if they have actually even gone down a little bit. But, our civics knowledge in general is very, very, very low.
Of course not for you guys, because I'm being honest that you guys know more probably already about the government than probably 90% of American citizens at least.
True statement. Where's the lie? Where's the lie? All right, so here you'll see decline in political participation. I think we've covered most of these topics.
Yeah, don't get bogged down on the names, because this, I don't know where they got this. Yeah, usually, yeah, I don't know. They're like the World War II generation.
Mr. Phillips, what is to the right of matures? I think that's your generation, right?
That's dead. That's dead. So those are has-beens. But Mr. Davila and I are both Gen Xers.
Oh,
so,
what?
But
Oh, Mr.
we're about the same age, and so
he wishes.
I don't know what .net is, but we talk about millennials, and now I guess you guys are
That's where I would
Generation
be.
Z, right? Generation Z. I don't know what comes after Z, but
Oh God.
so we'll see.
I'm a millennial.
But yeah, you can say that if you want.